There's a special kind of pain that comes when you lose the one person who knew you best. For Eli Mercer, that pain had been his companion for 6 long months since Clara walked away. He'd lost his ranch to fire, his marriage to silence, and his pride to poverty. Now he worked odd jobs in Copper Bend, just trying to survive each day. One night at the Silver Spur Saloon, Eli saw something that made his blood run cold. There was Clara, sitting close with James Harlow, his old trail partner and closest friend. The betrayal felt like a knife to the chest. But when Clara stood and looked him in the eye, she said something he never expected. What happened next would shake everything he thought he knew. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mountains of Montana have a way of making a man feel both infinite and insignificant at the same time. Eli Mercer had understood that truth since he was a boy, trailing behind his father through pine forests so thick the sunlight barely touched the ground. He'd learned to read the land the way other men read books. Every ridge, every creek, every stand of timber told a story if you knew how to listen. He met Clara Whitmore on a spring day in 1878 at a church social in Copper Bend. She'd been new to town, come west with her aunt after losing her parents to fever back in Ohio. Eli had been 24 then, already building a reputation as the finest rifle maker in 3 territories. He'd inherited his father's land and his grandfather's skill with metalwork, and he'd combined them into something rare. Rifles so well crafted they became heirlooms before they ever fired a shot. Clara had auburn hair that caught the sunlight like copper wire, and eyes the color of creek water in summer. But it wasn't her beauty that stopped Eli's heart that day. It was the way she looked at the mountains surrounding the town, with the same reverence he felt every morning when he stepped out onto his porch. She saw what he saw, not just rock and timber, but something sacred. Their courtship had been proper but brief. 3 months later, they married in that same church, with half the town in attendance and James Harlow standing as Eli's best man. James had been Eli's trail partner for 5 years by then, the kind of friend you could sit with in silence for hours and still feel like you'd had a good conversation. He'd helped Eli build the workshop behind the ranch house, and he'd stood beside Eli through a winter so harsh it killed half the livestock in the valley. The ranch itself sat in a bowl of land 15 miles north of town, where Ponderosa Creek ran clear and cold year-round. Eli's grandfather had claimed it in 1855, and his father had expanded it, and Eli had made it something more, not just a cattle operation, but a place where craftsmanship mattered. His workshop was his cathedral, a log building with windows facing east to catch the morning light. Inside, he'd built his forge, his workbenches, his racks of tools inherited and purchased and made by his own hands. Clara had taken to ranch life like she'd been born to it. She learned to ride, to shoot, to read the weather in the color of the dawn sky. She kept the books for Eli's rifle business, writing letters to customers from Denver to San Francisco, tracking orders and payments in a ledger she kept as neat as a Bible. In the evenings, she'd sit in the workshop with him, reading aloud while he worked, her voice a gentle counterpoint to the rasp of files and the ring of hammer on steel. For 4 years, life had been exactly what Eli had imagined when he was a boy dreaming of his future. The ranch prospered. His rifles earned him commissions from army officers and wealthy sportsmen. He and Clara talked about children, about building an addition onto the house, about the decades stretching ahead of them like an open road. Then came the fire. It started on a November night in 1882, when the first heavy snow was already weighing down the pine boughs. Eli had been in town that evening, delivering a finished rifle to a customer. Clara had stayed home, feeling poorly with a cold. When Eli rode back up the valley road just after midnight, he saw the glow against the clouds before he crested the final ridge. The workshop was fully engulfed, flames reaching 50 feet into the darkness. The heat was so intense it had ignited the side of the house nearest to it. Clara was in the yard in her nightdress and coat, her face streaked with soot, trying to work the pump to wet down the house. Eli rode straight into the chaos, and together they fought the fire until dawn. They saved the house barely, but the workshop burned to the ground, taking with it every tool, every half-finished rifle, every piece of raw material Eli had stockpiled for winter work. The marshal came out the next day, along with neighbors who brought food and offers of help. The marshal's verdict was simple. A coal had probably rolled out of the forge, caught some wood shavings. These things happened, accidents, acts of God. Eli had accepted that explanation because what else could he do? He'd lost 12 finished rifles waiting for shipment. He'd lost the advance payments customers had sent. He'd lost tools his grandfather had brought across the plains in a covered wagon. The insurance payment, when it finally came, covered less than half the loss. The debt had already been substantial. Eli had borrowed to expand the workshop the previous spring, confident the investment would pay for itself. Now, with no way to fulfill existing orders and no tools to make new rifles, the debt became a weight around his neck. The bank in Copper Bend sold the note to a collection agency in Helena. The letters started arriving in January, polite at first, then increasingly insistent. Eli had tried to hide the worst of it from Clara. He'd take the letters before she saw them, read them alone, stuff them in a drawer in the barn. He took work where he could find it, carpentry, day labor, anything to bring in cash. He sold off livestock. He sold Clara's piano, the beautiful upright she'd brought from Ohio. She hadn't said a word about it, but he'd seen the grief in her eyes. The silence between them grew like frost on a window pane, beautiful in its way but cold and impenetrable. They stopped talking about the future. They stopped sitting together in the evenings. Clara kept the books, but now the ledger only tracked debts, not income. Every meal became a quiet negotiation with scarcity. Every night became an exercise in sleeping beside someone while feeling utterly alone. In March, Clara moved into town, taking a room at her aunt's boarding house. She said she'd found work as a seamstress, that it made more sense than riding back and forth every day. Eli knew what she was really saying. She couldn't bear to watch him drowning anymore. The divorce papers came in April. Eli signed them without a fight. What could he offer her? A half-burned ranch and a pile of debts? By summer, Eli had moved to town himself, renting a small room above the saddle shop. He worked at the Silver Spur Saloon 3 nights a week, serving drinks and clearing tables. The owner, Tom Bradley, was a good man who'd known Eli's father. He paid fair and didn't ask questions about why a master craftsman was pouring whiskey for cowboys and miners. The work was simple and numbing, which was exactly what Eli wanted. He'd lost the identity he'd spent 30 years building. He was no longer Eli Mercer, master riflemaker. He was just another man trying to get by, another face in a town full of people carrying their own private grief. James Harlow had tried to help, of course. He'd offered money, offered work, offered partnership in his own freight business. But Eli's pride, that particularly stubborn variety that Montana men seem to cultivate like a crop, wouldn't let him accept. He'd made a mess of his life and he'd clean it up himself. That's what he told James anyway. What he didn't say was that accepting help felt like admitting he'd failed, and he couldn't do that. Not yet. Maybe not ever. So Eli existed in a kind of limbo, working enough to eat and pay rent, but not enough to imagine a future. He kept Clara's wedding ring in his pocket, a small gold band that had belonged to his grandmother. He'd touch it sometimes when he thought no one was looking, running his thumb over the worn metal like a talisman against despair. 6 months after the divorce, he'd convinced himself he'd reached a kind of peace, not happiness but acceptance. The past was gone. The future was a blank wall, and the present was a series of small tasks. Pour the drinks, sweep the floor, collect the wages, sleep, repeat. He'd been wrong about the peace. He'd been wrong about a lot of things. But he wouldn't know that until a Saturday night in October, when he looked up from behind the bar and saw his past and present collide in a way that would change everything he thought he understood about truth, about betrayal, and about the woman he'd never stopped loving. The Silver Spur was crowded that Saturday night, filled with the usual mix of ranch hands spending their wages. Miners in from the hills, and townsfolk looking for company and conversation. The air was thick with pipe smoke and the smell of whiskey, and the piano player was working through a repertoire of songs that ranged from church hymns to bawdy drinking tunes, depending on who was buying his drinks. Eli moved through it all with the practiced ease of a man who'd learned to make himself invisible. He delivered drinks, collected empty glasses, wiped down tables, and spoke only when spoken to. Tom Bradley worked the bar, and Sarah Chen, who'd come west with the railroad crews and stayed after her husband died in a tunnel collapse, handled the kitchen. It was honest work, and Eli was grateful for it, even if some part of him died a little every time he recognized a customer who'd once commissioned a rifle from him. He was carrying a tray of whiskey glasses to a table near the back when he saw her. Clara sat at a corner table, partially hidden by the crowd, but unmistakable to Eli's eyes. She wore a dark blue dress he didn't recognize, and her hair was pinned up in a style she'd never worn during their marriage. But it was her. The curve of her cheek, the way she held her hands folded on the table, the slight tilt of her head when she listened. And she was listening to James Harlow. James sat across from her, leaning forward slightly, speaking in a tone too low for Eli to hear over the general noise of the saloon. As Eli watched, frozen with his tray of glasses, James said something that made Clara laugh. Not a polite laugh, but a real one, the kind that lit up her whole face the way Eli remembered from their early days together. The tray trembled in Eli's hands. One of the glasses slid sideways, and he caught it just before it fell. The sound of glass against glass seemed impossibly loud in his ears, though no one else appeared to notice. He told himself to move, to turn away, to deliver the drinks and forget what he'd seen, but his feet wouldn't obey. He stood there, a statue in the middle of a moving crowd, watching his ex-wife share an intimate moment with his closest friend. James reached across the table and touched Clara's hand. It was a brief contact, almost nothing, but it landed on Eli like a physical blow. Clara didn't pull away. She smiled at James with a warmth that made Eli's chest ache with memory and loss. "You planning to deliver those drinks, or just hold them all night?" Tom Bradley's voice cut through Eli's paralysis. The saloon owner stood beside him, following Eli's gaze to the corner table. Tom's expression shifted from mild annoyance to something like sympathy. "Ah, I see. How long have they been here?" Eli's voice came out rough, like he'd swallowed gravel. "About an hour. Came in together. Ordered dinner." Tom took the tray from Eli's hands. "Go on outside. Get some air. I'll handle these." Eli shook his head. "I'm fine." "You're not fine. You look like a man about to throw a punch or collapse. Either way, I'd rather you do it outside my establishment." Tom's tone was kind but firm. "Go on, Eli. Take 10 minutes." But Eli didn't move toward the door. Instead, he found his feet carrying him toward the corner table, weaving through the crowd like a man in a dream or a nightmare. He couldn't tell which. James saw him first. His eyes widened, and he straightened in his chair. Clara followed James's gaze and turned. When she saw Eli, all the color drained from her face. For a long moment, none of them spoke. The noise of the saloon continued around them. Laughter, conversation, the clink of glasses, the piano playing something cheerful and inappropriate. But in the space between their table and where Eli stood, there was only silence and the weight of 6 months of grief. And now this new betrayal. "Eli," James said, starting to stand. "Don't." Eli's voice was quiet, but it stopped James mid-motion. "Just don't." Clara stood then, her napkin falling from her lap unnoticed. "Eli, please, this isn't..." "Isn't what?" Eli interrupted. His hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. "Isn't what it looks like, because from where I'm standing, it looks like my wife..." He stopped, corrected himself. "My ex-wife is having dinner with my best friend, looking real comfortable, real familiar." "It's not like that," Clara said. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were bright with something that might have been tears or might have been anger. "If you'd just let us explain..." "Explain what?" How long this has been going on, whether it started before or after you left me." The words came out bitter, each one a small blade. Eli hated how he sounded, wounded and petty, but he couldn't seem to stop. "I trusted both of you more than anyone in the world." James finally stood, holding up both hands in a placating gesture. "Brother, you've got this all wrong. We're not... Clara and I aren't..." He fumbled for words, which wasn't like James at all. James Harlow was a man who always knew what to say. "We've been trying to help you." "Help me?" Eli laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "That's what you call this? Helping?" "Yes," Clara said firmly. She took a step toward Eli, and he instinctively stepped back. The hurt that flashed across her face cut him deeper than he wanted to admit. "We have been helping you for months. Behind your back, yes, because you're too stubborn and proud to accept help from anyone." "I don't need help from you." Even as he said it, Eli knew it was a lie. He needed help desperately. He was drowning in debt and grief and loneliness, but accepting help meant admitting defeat, and he'd already lost so much. "That's where you're wrong," James said. His voice was gentle but carried an edge of frustration. "You need help whether you want it or not. And whether you believe it or not, Clara and I have been working to save you from the debt collectors." "Save me?" Eli's vision blurred at the edges. The room felt too hot, too crowded, too loud. "You're sitting here together in public, laughing and holding hands, and you want me to believe you're doing it to save me." By now, the surrounding tables had fallen quiet. People were watching, not even pretending otherwise. Eli could feel their eyes on him, could imagine what they were thinking. There's Eli Mercer, the man who lost everything, making a scene because he can't accept that his woman moved on. Clara seemed to notice the audience for the first time. She glanced around, then looked back at Eli with determination. "Not here. Come to the back room with us. Let us show you what we've been doing. Please, Eli, I'm asking you to trust me one more time." "Trust you." Eli turned the words over in his mind. Trust was what he'd given her when they married. Trust was what he'd thought they had, right up until she left. Trust was what he'd extended to James for years, believing that friendship was something solid and permanent. But trust was also a luxury he couldn't afford anymore. He looked at Clara, really looked at her for the first time since she'd moved out. She was thinner than she'd been, with shadows under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. Her dress was well made but not new. Her hands, when she reached toward him, showed calluses he didn't remember. These were the hands of a woman who'd been working hard, though at what, he didn't know. James stood beside her, and in his face Eli saw something he recognized, not guilt, but concern. The same expression James had worn the time Eli had nearly fallen off a cliff during a winter hunt, and James had grabbed him by the coat just in time. "It's not what you think," Clara said again, softer this time. "Please, Eli, it's not what you think." The room waited. The whole saloon seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what Eli Mercer would do. Would he walk away, taking his wounded pride with him? Would he throw a punch and give them all something to talk about for weeks? Instead, Eli felt something shift inside him. It wasn't trust exactly. It was more like exhaustion. He was tired of being angry, tired of being alone, tired of carrying all this weight by himself. "All right," he said quietly. "Show me." Clara's relief was visible, a tension releasing from her shoulders. James nodded, a small, grateful gesture. They led him toward the back room of the saloon, where Tom Bradley kept his office and held private card games. The crowd parted to let them through, and Eli could hear the whispers starting before they'd even closed the door behind them. Whatever they were about to tell him, the whole town would know by morning. But Eli supposed that didn't matter much anymore. In Copperbend, everyone already knew his business. Everyone knew he'd lost his ranch, his wife, and his livelihood. What was one more piece of public knowledge? The back room was small and plain, with a desk, a few chairs, and a lamp casting long shadows on the walls. James closed the door, muffling the saloon noise to a distant murmur. Clara stood near the desk, her hands clasped in front of her like she was about to deliver difficult news. Eli leaned against the wall, arms crossed, waiting. His heart hammered in his chest and his mouth was dry. Part of him wanted to leave right now, to walk out before they could say whatever they'd planned to say, but a larger part, the part that still loved Clara despite everything, the part that still considered James a brother, needed to hear the truth, whatever it was. "All right," he said again. "I'm listening." James moved to the desk and pulled out a worn leather satchel that had been tucked underneath. He set it on the desktop with a heavy thud, then looked at Eli with an expression that was equal parts apology and determination. "After the fire," James began, "I came by the ranch to help you salvage what we could. You remember that?" Eli nodded. He remembered those first few days after the fire, when everything had been chaos and ash. James had been there every day helping, to sort through the wreckage, moving the saved furniture from the house into the barn, doing the 100 tasks that needed doing when your whole world had just burned down. "While we were clearing the workshop ruins, I found something." James reached into the satchel and pulled out a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. He laid it on the desk and carefully unwrapped it, revealing 3 rifles. Not just any rifles, Eli's work. The metal gleamed in the lamplight, the wood stocks showing the intricate carvings that had been Eli's signature. These were in the stone cellar under the workshop. The fire didn't reach them. Eli stared at the rifles. He'd forgotten about the cellar, a small space his grandfather had dug to store gunpowder and valuable materials. "I thought everything was lost." "Not everything," Clara said quietly. "James found 5 rifles that day. He took them to his place for safekeeping. I was going to tell you," James said quickly. "But you were in such a state, Eli, and then the debt collector started showing up, and I thought—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I thought if they knew you had something of value, they'd seize it to cover the debt." Eli's jaw tightened. "So you kept my property hidden from me?" "To protect it," James said. "To protect you? I didn't know about any of this," Clara said. "Not right away. After I moved to town, I kept thinking about you out at that ranch, alone, drowning in debt. I couldn't sleep, couldn't stop worrying." She moved closer to the desk, her fingers trailing along the edge. "One day I went to see James. I asked him if there was anything we could do. Anything at all. That's when I told her about the rifles," James continued. "And we came up with a plan." Clara reached into her own bag and pulled out a bundle of letters, bound together with string. She set them on the desk next to the rifles. "Do you remember the debt collection letters you were getting?" Eli's face flushed. "How do you know about those?" "Because I found them," Clara said softly. "After I moved out, I went back to the ranch one day to get some of my things. I found them in the barn, Eli, dozens of them, stuffed in a drawer, shoved under feed sacks. Some were months old." Her voice caught. "You never told me how bad it really was." The shame Eli had been carrying for months rose up fresh and hot in his chest. "I was handling it." "You weren't handling it," Clara said, not unkindly. "You were drowning, and you were too proud to call for help. So when James told me about the rifles, I saw a way to help you whether you wanted it or not." James picked up the story. "Clara's better with numbers and business than either of us ever gave her credit for. She came up with the plan, sell the rifles one at a time to collectors and sporting goods stores. Use the money to pay down your debt. Without telling me," Eli said flatly. "Would you have agreed if we'd asked?" Clara challenged. "Would you have let me help you after the divorce? Would you have taken money from James?" Eli had no answer because they both knew the truth. His pride would never have allowed it. Clara opened one of the letters and held it out to him. "This is from a collector in San Francisco. He paid $300 for one of your rifles." "300, Eli. That's more than most men make in 6 months." Eli took the letter, scanning the formal business language, the enthusiastic praise for the craftsmanship, the promise of future purchases. His hands trembled slightly as he set it back on the desk. James pulled out a ledger, the kind Clara had always kept for their business. "We've sold 3 rifles so far. The first one went to that San Francisco collector. The second to an Army officer at Fort Benton. The third to a judge in Helena. He opened the ledger, turning it so Eli could see the neat columns of numbers. "Between the 3 sales, we've brought in $850. Eli's breath caught. $850. That was more than half of what he owed the debt collectors. "We've already paid off $400 of your debt," Clara said. "I handled the negotiations with the collection agency in Helena. They were willing to accept partial payment with a promise of more to come." "Why?" Eli's voice was hoarse. "Why would you do this?" "You divorced me, Clara. You left." Clara's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. "I left because I was scared, Eli. Scared of being poor. Scared of watching you work yourself to death, trying to fix something that seemed impossible to fix. But I never stopped loving you. Not for one single day." The words hit Eli like a blow. He'd spent 6 months convincing himself that Clara had left because she didn't love him anymore, that he'd failed her so completely she couldn't bear to stay. Hearing the truth, that she'd left out of fear, not lack of love, rearranged everything he thought he understood. "I thought," Eli said slowly, "when I saw you two together tonight, I thought that we'd betrayed you," James finished. "I know, and I'm sorry we let you think that, even for a moment, but we had to be careful. If word got out that you had valuable rifles, the debt collectors might have found a way to claim them. So we met in secret. We handled the sales quietly. We kept the money separate from anything that could be traced back to you." Clara wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "We were going to tell you once the debt was paid off completely. We wanted to give you back your land free and clear, to give you a fresh start. We thought," her voice broke, "we thought it would be a gift, a way to make up for everything that went wrong." Eli looked at the rifles on the desk, at the ledger with its neat columns, at the letters from satisfied customers. He looked at James, who'd been his friend since they were both young men learning to read the wilderness. He looked at Clara, whose face showed the same love and determination he'd fallen for all those years ago. His anger drained away, replaced by something more complex. Gratitude mixed with shame, relief tangled with regret. They'd been trying to save him while he'd been drowning in pride and self-pity. They'd been working together in secret, sacrificing their own time and energy to fix his problems. "I don't know what to say," Eli admitted. "You don't have to say anything," James said. "Just let us finish what we started. We have 2 more rifles to sell. Once that's done, your debt will be cleared, and you can start rebuilding. We can help you rebuild the workshop," Clara added. "James has been collecting tools at auction houses. I've been setting aside money from my sewing work. We've got enough to get you started again, if you'll let us." Eli sat down heavily in one of the chairs. His mind was reeling, trying to process everything they'd told him. 6 months of misery, 6 months of believing he'd lost everything. And all that time these 2 people had been working to save him. "I've been such a fool," he said quietly. "No," Clara said, kneeling beside his chair. "You've been hurt and proud and doing the best you could." "We all have been." James placed a hand on Eli's shoulder. "We're not telling you this to make you feel bad, brother. We're telling you because you deserve to know the truth, and because we need you to stop carrying all this alone." Eli looked at Clara, seeing in her face the woman he'd married, the woman he'd shared his dreams with. "When you left, I thought it was because I wasn't enough. Because I'd failed you." "You never failed me," Clara said fiercely. "The situation failed us. The fire, the debt, the fear, all of it. But you never failed me, Eli Mercer." For the first time in 6 months, Eli felt something other than grief and shame. It was tentative, fragile as new ice on a winter pond, but it was there, hope. "Show me the rest," he said. "Show me everything." They spent the next hour in that back room, while the saloon noise continued beyond the door. Clara and James laid out everything, the correspondence with buyers, the careful negotiations with the debt collectors, the detailed accounting of every dollar spent and saved. They showed Eli the remaining 2 rifles, both wrapped carefully in oilcloth, both representing the craftsmanship that had once defined his identity. But as the initial shock wore off, questions began to surface in Eli's mind, hard questions that needed asking, even if the answers might hurt. "Why didn't you tell me? he asked, not for the first time, but with more focus now. I understand keeping it secret from the debt collectors, but why not tell me what you were doing? Clara and James exchanged a look, the kind of silent communication that comes from spending time together. That look bothered Eli more than he wanted to admit. Because you would have stopped us, Clara said simply. You would have insisted on handling it yourself, or you would have refused the help entirely. You know that's true. Eli wanted to argue, but he couldn't. She was right. If they'd come to him 6 months ago and said they wanted to sell his rifles to pay his debts, he would have refused. He would have seen it as charity, as pity, as one more way he'd failed to take care of his own problems. I had a right to know, he said instead. You did, James agreed. And we were wrong to keep it from you. But Eli, we watched you after the fire. We watched you pull away from everyone, shut yourself off, refuse every offer of help. What were we supposed to do? Let you lose everything because you were too stubborn to accept a hand up? It's my life, Eli said, hearing the defensiveness in his own voice. My debts, my problems. You had no right to go behind my back, no matter how good your intentions were. Clara's expression hardened slightly. And you had no right to shut me out, to hide those letters, to lie about how bad things were. We were married, Eli. We were supposed to be partners. But you treated me like I was too fragile to handle the truth. The accusation stung because it was accurate. Eli had hidden the worst of their financial situation from Clara, telling himself he was protecting her. But really, he'd been protecting himself from having to admit how completely he'd failed, from having to see disappointment in her eyes. I didn't want you to see me like that, Eli admitted. Broken, helpless, and I didn't want to be the woman who ran away when things got hard, Clara said. But that's what I did. I was so scared of being poor again, of going back to the kind of life I had as a child, that I left instead of staying to fight beside you. So we both made mistakes, Eli. We both let fear drive us instead of love. James cleared his throat. Maybe I should step outside, let you two talk privately. No, Eli said. You're part of this too. You've been working just as hard as Clara to fix my problems. Our problems, Clara corrected. They were our problems, Eli, the debt, the ranch, all of it. We built that life together, and we should have faced its loss together. I understand that now. Eli picked up one of the rifles, feeling the familiar weight of his own work in his hands. The stock was black walnut, carved with a pattern of pine trees and mountains that had taken him 3 days to complete. The metal was blued steel, perfectly balanced, the kind of weapon that would last for generations if properly cared for. These rifles, he said quietly, they were supposed to be our future. Each one I made, I'd think about what it would buy. A new dress for you, better stock for the ranch, maybe someday a college education for children we hadn't had yet. I'd pour everything I was into them, and now they're being sold off to pay for my failures. Not failures, James said firmly. Survival. There's a difference. Is there? Eli set the rifle down carefully. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like I lost everything that mattered. And the only reason I'm not completely ruined is because my ex-wife and my best friend took pity on me. It's not pity, Clara said, her voice rising. How can you think that? I'm doing this because I love you. Because even though we're divorced, even though I was too afraid to stay, I never stopped believing in you. I never stopped hoping we'd find our way back to each other. The raw honesty in her words cut through Eli's defenses. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not the woman who'd left him, but the woman who'd been fighting for him all along. She'd been fighting in the only way she knew how. Doing the thing he'd been too proud to do himself, asking for help, accepting reality, working within the constraints they'd been given. I don't know how to accept this, Eli said. I don't know how to be grateful when I feel like I should have been able to handle it myself. Then learn, Clara said. Learn to let people help you. Learn to trust that accepting help doesn't make you weak, it makes you human. James reached into the satchel and pulled out one more item, a small wooden box. He opened it to reveal a collection of tools, files, calipers, a small hammer with a worn handle. I've been buying your grandfather's tools back, he said. The ones the debt collectors sold off? Some of them anyway. Figured when you're ready to start again you'd want them. Eli's throat tightened. Those tools had been in his family for 3 generations. Seeing them now, rescued from whoever had bought them at auction, felt like reclaiming a piece of his lost identity. How much did all this cost you? Eli asked. Doesn't matter, James said. It matters to me. Then it'll matter later when you're back on your feet and you can pay me back if you insist on it. Right now, all that matters is that you accept what we're offering, not as charity, but as what it is. Love, friendship, the kind of help you've given other people your whole life, but never learned to accept for yourself. Eli touched the tools, each one familiar to his hands. He thought about the rifles waiting to be sold, about the money already paid toward his debts, about the careful planning that had gone into all of this. Clara and James had been working together for months, meeting in secret, coordinating their efforts, all to save him from the consequences of his own pride and bad luck. I saw you holding her hand, Eli said to James, at the table. Before I came over. James nodded slowly. She was crying, talking about how much she missed you, how she wished things had gone differently. I was trying to comfort her. That's all it was, brother. That's all it's ever been. We're not... Clara started, then stopped. James and I are friends, Eli. He's been helping me because he loves you, and I've been working with him for the same reason. There's nothing romantic between us. There never has been. Eli wanted to believe them. Most of him did believe them. But 6 months of pain and loneliness had created doubts that wouldn't disappear in a single conversation. I need time, he said finally, to think about all this, to figure out what it means. Take all the time you need, Clara said. But know this, we're not stopping. We're going to sell those last 2 rifles, whether you approve or not. We're going to finish paying off your debt, and when it's done, you'll have a choice. You can start over alone, or you can let us help you rebuild. That part is up to you. Eli stood suddenly exhausted. The emotional whiplash of the evening, from seeing Clara and James together to learning the truth, to confronting his own pride and fear, had drained him completely. I should go, he said. James stood as well. Think about what we've said, Eli, and think about this. Sometimes the strongest thing a man can do is admit he needs help. Clara walked him to the door. Before he left, she touched his arm gently. I meant what I said. I never stopped loving you. Eli nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. He left the back room, walking through the saloon where people still drank and talked and played cards, where the piano still jangled out its cheerful tunes. Tom Bradley caught his eye from behind the bar and nodded, a gesture of understanding, of respect. Outside, the October night was cold and clear. Eli stood on the wooden sidewalk, looking up at the stars scattered across the vast Montana sky. Somewhere up in those mountains was his ranch, half burned and empty. Somewhere in this town was a future he couldn't quite see yet, but for the first time in 6 months, he thought maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone as he'd believed. Eli didn't sleep that night. He lay in his small room above the saddle shop, listening to the occasional sounds of late-night travelers on the street below, staring at the ceiling and turning everything over in his mind. Clara's words echoed in his thoughts. I never stopped loving you. James's steady voice. Sometimes the strongest thing a man can do is admit he needs help. By dawn, he'd made a decision. Not a complete one, maybe, but enough to take the next step. He found James at his freight office just after sunrise. James was loading a wagon, preparing for a run to one of the mining camps in the hills. When he saw Eli approaching, he set down the crate he'd been carrying and waited. I want to help, Eli said without preamble. With the rifles, the sales, whatever needs doing. I want to be part of it. James studied him for a long moment, then nodded. All right. Clara's at her aunt's boarding house. We were planning to write letters to potential buyers this morning. You should come. They walked together through the quiet streets of Copper Bend, past the shops just opening for business, past the church where Eli and Clara had married 5 years ago. The boarding house sat on the edge of town, a 2-story building with a wraparound porch and flower boxes that Clara's aunt kept filled with geraniums even this late in the season. Clara was in the small parlor her aunt let her use for business, surrounded by papers and ledgers. When Eli walked in behind James, she stood up quickly, her expression uncertain. "I want to help," Eli said again. "If you'll let me." The relief on Clara's face was immediate and profound. "Of course, sit down. I'll show you what we've been working on." The next hours passed in a kind of careful choreography. Clara showed Eli the list of potential buyers she'd compiled: collectors, sporting goods dealers, military officers who appreciated fine craftsmanship. James explained the pricing strategy they'd developed, how they'd learned to negotiate for the best possible return. Eli listened, asked questions, and slowly began to understand the scope of what they'd been doing. It wasn't just about selling rifles. It was about rebuilding his reputation, about reminding the world that Eli Mercer's work had value. Each sale came with a story: the craftsmanship, the artistry, the legacy of 3 generations of rifle makers. Clara had learned to sell not just weapons, but pieces of Montana history. "You're good at this," Eli told her, watching as she drafted a letter to a potential buyer in Denver. "Better than I ever was." "You were good at making them," Clara said. "I'm good at selling them. We made a good team." The past tense hung in the air between them. Made, not make. The acknowledgement of what they'd lost. Over the following days, Eli fell into a new routine. He still worked his shifts at the Silver Spur, but his mornings were spent at the boarding house with Clara and James, working on the business of selling his rifles. They drafted letters together, discussed pricing, debated whether to accept offers or hold out for better ones. Slowly, awkwardly, they began to rebuild something that resembled their old relationships. Eli and James fell back into their familiar patterns, the quiet companionship of men who'd spent years working side by side. With Clara, it was more complicated. Every conversation carried the weight of their history, every accidental touch a reminder of intimacy lost. One morning, nearly 2 weeks after the revelation at the Silver Spur, Clara brought out a small leather-bound book. "I kept this," she said, setting it on the table between them. "During our marriage. I thought you should see it." Eli opened the diary, recognizing Clara's neat handwriting. The first entry was dated a week after their wedding. He read slowly, absorbing her words, her joy at their marriage, her pride in his work, her dreams for their future. As the entries progressed, he saw her growing concerns about money, her attempts to economize, her worries about telling him how scared she was. One entry, written a month before the fire, struck him particularly hard. "Eli works so hard, carries so much on his shoulders. I wish he would talk to me about his worries, instead of pretending everything is fine. I can see the strain in his face, but when I ask, he just smiles and says not to worry. Doesn't he know I worry more when he won't share his burdens?" Eli closed the diary carefully. "You saw what I was trying to hide." "I always saw it," Clara said. "I just didn't know how to make you trust me with the truth. I thought I was protecting you, I know. But Eli, I didn't need protection. I needed a partner, someone who would face the hard times with me, not shield me from them like I was a child." James, who'd been working on paperwork in the corner, looked up. "That's what I tried to tell you too. After the fire, but you wouldn't hear it from anyone." Eli thought about his father, who'd taught him that a man takes care of his own problems. His grandfather, who'd survived the journey west through sheer determination and refusal to accept help from anyone. 3 generations of Mercer men who'd built their identity on self-reliance and stubborn pride. "Maybe," Eli said slowly, "maybe I've been carrying the wrong lessons." Clara reached across the table and touched his hand briefly. "It's not wrong to be strong, Eli. It's just wrong to think strength means standing alone." That afternoon they received word that a collector in Billings wanted to buy both remaining rifles. The offer was generous, $700 for the pair. It was enough to pay off the rest of Eli's debt with money left over. "We should take it," James said. But Eli hesitated. Those rifles represented the last pieces of his old life, the last tangible evidence of the craftsman he'd been. Selling them felt like closing a door that he wasn't sure he was ready to close. "What if I never make another rifle?" he asked. "What if I can't rebuild the workshop, can't afford the materials, can't find the customers? These might be the last rifles with my name on them." Clara looked at him with an expression that was both gentle and firm. "Or they might be the foundation for everything you build next. You can spend your life holding on to the past, or you can use it to create a future." "She's right," James added. "These rifles will go to someone who appreciates them. And the money will give you freedom. Freedom from debt, freedom to start over however you choose." Islish walked to the window, looking out at the mountains in the distance. Up there, somewhere beyond the ridgeline, was his ranch. The burned workshop, the empty house, the land that still belonged to him, at least for now. He thought about his grandfather, crossing the plains with nothing but determination and a wagon full of tools. About his father, building a life in the wilderness through hard work and skill. About himself, at 30 years old, standing at a crossroads with nothing left to prove and everything left to build. "Accept the offer," he said finally. "Sell them both." Clara's smile was like sunrise. She immediately began drafting the acceptance letter, her pen moving quickly across the paper. James clapped Eli on the shoulder, a gesture of approval and support. As Eli watched Clara work, he felt something shift in his chest. Not quite forgiveness, not yet, but something close. Understanding, maybe. Acceptance of the choices they'd both made, the mistakes they'd both committed. The love that had somehow survived despite everything. "When the money comes through," Clara said without looking up from her letter, "and the debt is paid, what will you do?" It was the question Eli had been avoiding. With no debt, he'd have choices. He could rebuild the ranch, return to rifle making. He could leave Copper Bend entirely, start fresh somewhere new. He could continue working odd jobs, living simply, making no demands on life and letting life make no demands on him. "I don't know yet," Eli admitted. "Well," Clara said, finally looking up at him, "when you figure it out, I hope you'll tell me. Because whatever you decide, I'd like to be part of it. If you'll have me." The words hung in the air, a question and an offer and a hope all wrapped together. Eli didn't answer right away because he didn't have an answer yet. But he held her gaze and nodded, a small gesture that said maybe, that said possibly, that said he was willing to consider a future he couldn't quite imagine yet. James stood stretching his back. "I should get to work. That freight won't deliver itself. You two all right here?" "We're fine," Clara said. After James left, Eli and Clara sat in companionable silence for a while. The morning sun streamed through the windows, warming the small parlor. Somewhere in the boarding house, Clara's aunt was singing as she worked. On the street outside, a wagon rolled past, the horses' hooves clopping steadily on the packed dirt. "Do you remember," Clara said softly, "the first time you showed me your workshop? You were so proud, showing me each tool, explaining what it was for. You carved a wooden flower for me that day, just a simple thing, but you spent an hour getting it perfect." Eli remembered. He'd kept that wooden flower on his workbench, a reminder of the day he'd shared his world with the woman he loved. "It burned in the fire," he said. "No," Clara said. "I have it. I took it when I moved out. I couldn't leave it behind." She reached into her bag and pulled out the small wooden flower, slightly worn but still recognizable. She set it on the table between them, a bridge across 6 months of separation and pain. Eli picked it up, feeling the smooth wood against his fingers, remembering the joy he'd felt making it. "I thought everything from that life was gone." "Not everything," Clara said. "Some things survive, even fires." The payment from the billings collector arrived 3 weeks later. $700 in banknotes, more money than Eli had seen in one place since before the fire. Clara handled the transaction with the debt collectors, paying off the remaining balance and securing documentation that the debt was satisfied in full. The day the papers came through, the three of them met at James's freight office. James had bought a bottle of decent whiskey for the occasion, and they passed it around, each taking a drink straight from the bottle in the old frontier way. "To freedom from debt," James said. "Raising the bottle. To new beginnings," Clara added. Eli took his drink and said nothing, but he felt the weight lifting from his shoulders. A burden he'd carried so long, he'd almost forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. With the debt cleared, Eli found himself in unfamiliar territory. For months, his life had been defined by what he owed, what he'd lost, what he couldn't have. Now suddenly he had choices again. The realization was both liberating and terrifying. He continued his work at the Silver Spur, but his heart wasn't in it anymore. Tom Bradley noticed, and in his quiet way let Eli know there were no hard feelings if he wanted to move on. The saddle shop owner said the same about the room Eli rented. Everyone in Copper Bend seemed to understand that Eli was in transition, moving towards something even if he couldn't yet say what. One evening, Clara asked him to take a walk with her. They headed to the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to open land, and you could see the mountains clearly in the fading light. "I've been thinking about the ranch," Clara said. "About what it would take to rebuild." "I've been thinking about it too," Eli admitted. "James and I put together some numbers. With the money left after paying the debt, and what I've saved from sewing, and what James can contribute, we'd have enough to rebuild the workshop. Maybe not as large as before, but enough to start again." Eli stopped walking. "Why would James invest in my business?" "Because he believes in you. Because he's your friend. And because he's smart enough to know that a partnership with a master rifle maker could be profitable for everyone." "A partnership?" Clara nodded. "James provides the capital and handles the freight and sales. You provide the craftsmanship. I manage the business side, orders, accounting, correspondence. We split the profits 3 ways. It was a generous offer, more generous than Eli deserved. It was also a lifeline, a way forward he hadn't been able to see on his own." "And us?" Eli asked. "Where do you and I fit in all this?" Clara looked out at the mountains, her profile outlined against the sunset. "That's up to you, Eli. I've told you how I feel. I never stopped loving you, and I'd be your wife again tomorrow if you asked. But I won't push. You need to figure out what you want, and I need to know that if we try again, you'll trust me enough to be a real partner. Not someone you protect or shelter, but someone you build with." "I don't know if I know how to do that," Eli said honestly. "Then learn," Clara said, echoing her words from weeks before. "We'll learn together. But Eli, I need you to understand something. If we rebuild this business, if we go back to the ranch and start over, I won't be the woman I was before. I'm stronger now, more sure of myself. I've learned I can survive on my own, and that changes things." "I can see that," Eli said. And he could. The Clara standing beside him was different from the woman who'd left 6 months ago. There was a confidence in her bearing, a certainty in her voice that hadn't been there before. "I think I'm different too." "Good," Clara said. "Maybe we needed to break apart to figure out who we are separately. Maybe now we can build something better together." They walked back toward town in comfortable silence. When they reached the boarding house, Clara turned to him. "There's something else you should know. A man came by today asking about you." "Debt collector?" Eli's stomach tightened automatically. "No. He said his name was Marcus Tate, said he was representing someone interested in buying your land." The name sent a chill through Eli. "What did you tell him?" "That you weren't interested in selling." But Eli, he was persistent. He mentioned something about mineral surveys and development opportunities. I didn't like him, neither did Eli, though he couldn't say exactly why. Something about a stranger showing interest in his land now, just when the debt was cleared, felt wrong. "I'll look into it," he said. "Be careful," Clara said. "I got a bad feeling from that man." The next morning, Eli went to the county recorder's office. The clerk, an older man named Harvey, who'd known Eli's father, pulled out the records for Eli's property. "Interesting timing," Harvey said. "This is the second request for your property records this month." Who else was asking? "Man named Howard Brennan. Said he was considering some investments in the area." Harvey pushed his spectacles up his nose. "Between you and me, Eli, Brennan's got a reputation. He buys up land on the cheap, usually from folks in financial trouble. There've been some questions about his methods." "What kind of questions?" "The kind nobody can prove, but everybody suspects. Properties that mysteriously burn or flood right before he makes an offer. Debts that suddenly appear or increase. Nothing you can take to court, but enough to make a careful man cautious." Eli felt something cold settle in his stomach. Have there been any surveys of my land recently? Harvey rifled through the papers. Not official ones, no. But there was a geological survey done of the whole valley last year, part of a territorial assessment for mining potential. He pulled out a map, spreading it across the counter. See here? Your property sits right on top of what they suspect is a significant silver deposit. Nothing's been proven, but if it's there, it'd be worth a considerable fortune. Eli stared at the map, at the marks indicating mineral deposits, at his property sitting right in the middle of them. And Brennan knows about this? I'd wager he does. Brennan makes it his business to know about opportunities. Question is, what's he willing to do to acquire them? Eli thanked Harvey and left, his mind churning. The fire that destroyed his workshop, had it really been an accident? The debt that had seemed to grow beyond what he actually owed, had someone been inflating it deliberately? Marcus Tate showing up now, offering to buy the land, was it all connected? He found James at his warehouse and explained what he'd learned. James listened carefully, his expression growing serious. I think we need to talk to the marshal, James said. If what you're suggesting is true, Brennan committed arson at the very least. We don't have proof, Eli said. Just suspicions, then we find proof. There's got to be something. Someone who saw something, records that don't match up, witnesses who can connect Brennan to what happened. They brought Clara into the discussion that afternoon. She listened to everything, her face growing pale as the implications became clear. He destroyed your life to steal your land, she said quietly. The fire, the debt, all of it. It was deliberate. We don't know that for certain, Eli cautioned. Not yet, but Clara was already moving, pulling out papers, making notes. Then we find out for certain. We dig into this until we know the truth. Looking at her fierce determination, at James's steady loyalty, Eli felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Righteous anger. Not the bitter, self-pitying anger he'd carried for months, but the clean anger of a man who'd been wronged and intended to set things right. All right, he said. Let's find out what Howard Brennan did, and let's make sure he pays for it. The investigation started quietly. Clara used her connections in town, the women she sewed for, the merchants she did business with, to gather information about Howard Brennan. James talked to the freighters and ranch hands who passed through his warehouse, men who traveled the territory and heard things. Eli went back through his records, comparing what he'd actually borrowed against what the debt collectors had claimed he owed. Within a week, a picture began to emerge. Howard Brennan was a land speculator from Helena who'd made his fortune acquiring properties from desperate owners. He had business interests in mining, timber, and real estate across 3 territories. He was wealthy, well-connected, and according to everyone they talked to, absolutely ruthless. He's been buying up land all through this valley, Clara reported one evening. They'd gathered at James's office, which had become their headquarters for the investigation. In the past 2 years, he's acquired 7 properties, all of them from owners in financial distress. And at least 3 of those properties had suspicious fires or accidents right before the owners sold, James added. He spread out a map of the valley, marking each property Brennan had acquired. See the pattern? He's buying up a corridor that runs right through the mineral deposits Harvey showed us. Eli studied the map. His property sat right in the middle of Brennan's acquisitions, a gap in what would otherwise be a continuous holding. If he controls all this land, he controls access to the entire silver deposit, worth millions, James said. Maybe tens of millions, depending on how deep the deposit runs. But we still don't have proof he caused the fire, Clara said. We have suspicion, we have motive, we have a pattern. But we don't have evidence that would stand up in court. That's when James remembered something. There was a man in town the week before the fire. I noticed him because he wasn't local, and he had the look of someone who didn't want to be noticed. He was asking questions about properties in the area, pretending to be a surveyor. Do you remember what he looked like? Eli asked. Average height, dark beard, scar across his left hand. I remember the scar because he used that hand to pay for supplies at my warehouse. He bought rope, lamp oil, matches, things you'd need for camping, he said. Or things you'd need to start a fire, Eli thought. We need to find this man, Clara said. If he was working for Brennan, if we can get him to testify. That's a big if, James cautioned. Even if we find him, why would he admit to arson? He'd be confessing to a crime. They spent the next 2 weeks searching. James put out word through the freight network, describing the man and offering a reward for information. Clara wrote to contacts in nearby towns, asking if anyone had seen someone matching the description. Eli talked to everyone who'd been in Copper Bend around the time of the fire, trying to jog memories. Finally, they got a lead. A ranch hand reported seeing a man matching the description working odd jobs at a cattle operation 30 miles south of town. James and Eli rode out immediately, taking the better part of a day to reach the ranch. They found him there, calling himself John Cole, working in the stable. When Eli and James approached, the man's face went pale. He recognized them, which meant he knew exactly who Eli was and what his presence meant. "We just want to talk," James said calmly. "No law involved yet. Just talk." Cole looked around as if considering running, then his shoulders sagged. "I figured someone would come eventually. Surprised it took this long." They moved to the ranch's bunkhouse, empty at midday with most of the hands out working. Cole sat on a bunk, his scarred hand rubbing nervously against his knee. "Howard Brennan hired me last November," Cole said without being asked. He spoke quickly, as if he'd been carrying this confession for months and was relieved to finally let it out. "Paid me $200 to set a fire. Said the owner had insurance, that he'd be fine, that it was just business. I needed the money. My wife was sick and the doctor bills." He stopped, shook his head. "There's no excuse. I knew it was wrong. You set fire to my workshop," Eli said, keeping his voice level though his hands were clenched into fists. "I did. I came at night when I knew you were in town. Made sure your wife was out of the house before I lit it. I'm not a murderer, at least. Just a fool who made a terrible choice. Did Brennan tell you why he wanted the fire set?" James asked. "He said you had a property he wanted to buy, but you were too stubborn to sell. Said the fire would convince you to give up, move on. He didn't tell me about the silver, but I'm not stupid. I figured it out later." "And the debt?" Eli asked. "Did he have anything to do with that?" Cole nodded. "He bought your loan from the collection agency. Then he added charges, interest, fees, penalties that were never part of the original debt. He inflated what you owed by near about 40%. The plan was to use the inflated debt to force you into selling." Eli felt his anger rising, hot and sharp. This man, this stranger, had destroyed his life on Brennan's orders, had burned down years of work, shattered his marriage, taken away his identity. "All for money. Why are you telling us this?" James asked. "You've got to know this could land you in prison, because my wife died 2 months ago," Cole said flatly. "The money Brennan paid me, it wasn't enough. She died anyway, and I've been living with what I did ever since. I can't undo it, but maybe I can make it right somehow. You want me to testify against Brennan? I'll do it. You want me to go to jail? I probably deserve it. I'm tired of running from what I did." The three of them rode back to Copper Bend, with Cole between them. The man didn't try to escape, didn't make excuses. He just rode silently, looking like a man who'd already given up. They went straight to the marshal's office. Marshal Tom Hendricks was a man in his 50s who'd kept the peace in Copper Bend for 20 years. He listened to Cole's confession, making notes, asking clarifying questions. "This is serious," Hendricks said when Cole had finished. "Arson, fraud, conspiracy. If what you're saying is true, Brennan's looking at significant prison time." "It's true," Cole said. "I'll swear to it in court. I'll testify to everything." "We'll need more than just your word," Hendricks said. "Brennan's got money and lawyers. He'll try to discredit you, claim you're lying for revenge or money or whatever story his lawyers concoct. We need documents, records, something that ties Brennan directly to the fire and the debt manipulation." Clara, who'd been waiting at the marshal's office with a growing crowd of townsfolk, spoke up. "I have the debt records. I can show the discrepancies between what Eli originally owed and what the collectors were claiming." "That helps," Hendricks said. "But we need something that connects Brennan to the fraudulent charges and to Cole. We need paper trail, witnesses, something concrete." "I have papers," Cole said. Letters from Brennan, payment records. I kept them, don't know why. Maybe I knew someday I'd need insurance against him coming after me. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded envelope. It's all here. Letters in Brennan's handwriting instructing me on when and how to set the fire. Payment vouchers from his company? Everything? Hendricks took the envelope, examining the documents carefully. His expression grew more serious with each page he read. This is it. This is what we need. These letters alone are enough to arrest Brennan and bring him up on charges. The news spread through Copper Bend like wildfire. By evening, half the town knew that Howard Brennan had been behind Eli's misfortune, that there was going to be an investigation, possibly a trial. People Eli hadn't spoken to in months came by to offer support, to express outrage, to promise they'd testify about anything they'd seen or heard. James organized everything with his typical efficiency. He collected statements from people who'd seen coal in town before the fire. He gathered records from other property owners who'd sold to Brennan, looking for similar patterns of suspicious accidents and inflated debts. Clara compiled all the financial evidence, creating a clear timeline of the fraud. 3 days later, Marshal Hendricks, accompanied by a territorial judge and 2 deputies, rode to Helena to arrest Howard Brennan. The charges included arson, fraud, conspiracy, and extortion. The evidence was overwhelming. Brennan was brought back to Copper Bend in chains. When his wagon rolled into town, it seemed like every resident turned out to watch. Eli stood on the steps of the saloon, Clara beside him, James on his other side. They watched as the man who'd destroyed Eli's life was led to the jail, his expensive suit dusty from the road, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. He thought he'd gotten away with it, Clara said quietly. He almost did, Eli replied. If you and James hadn't helped me, if we hadn't started investigating, he would have. That night, the 3 of them sat in the back room of the Silver Spur, the same room where Clara and James had first revealed the truth to Eli. It felt like years had passed since that night, though it had been less than 2 months. There'll be a trial, James said. Probably take a few months to work through the court system. But Cole's testimony and those letters, Brennan's going to prison, Clara said with certainty. And the fraudulent debt charges will be dismissed. The court might even order Brennan to pay restitution. I don't want his money, Eli said. I just want my land clear, my name cleared. You'll have both, James said. And more. When this story gets out, and it will, your reputation as a rifle maker is going to spread. People will want your work because of who you are, what you overcame. Eli looked at the 2 people who'd saved him when he couldn't save himself. I couldn't have done this alone. You didn't have to do it alone, Clara said. That's what we've been trying to tell you all along. Outside, Copper Bend settled into its evening rhythms. But inside that back room, 3 people sat together, united by the truth they'd uncovered and the justice they'd secured. The road ahead was still uncertain. There would be a trial, testimony, probably months of legal proceedings. But for the first time since the fire, Eli felt like he was standing on solid ground again. The past 6 months had taught him hard lessons about pride, about trust, about the difference between standing alone and standing strong. He'd learned that accepting help wasn't weakness, that being vulnerable wasn't the same as being defeated. He'd learned that some truths really did hit harder than bullets, and some hearts really didn't quit, even when you thought they had. Most importantly, he'd learned that the hardest thing to rebuild wasn't a ranch or a business, or even a life. It was trust, in others and in himself. The weeks leading up to the trial were a strange mixture of anticipation and dread. Howard Brennan had hired a team of lawyers from San Francisco, expensive men in tailored suits who arrived in Copper Bend like an invading army. They took rooms at the hotel, interviewed witnesses, and made it clear they intended to fight every charge with everything they had. Brennan himself sat in the county jail, posting bail but choosing to remain in custody. His lawyers advised it, better to appear humble and wronged than wealthy and arrogant. But everyone in town saw through the strategy. They saw a man who'd built an empire on the suffering of others, and they wanted justice. Eli, Clara, and James prepared for the trial with the same methodical care they'd brought to the investigation. The territorial prosecutor, a young man named William Thatcher, who'd recently been appointed to the position, met with them regularly. He was sharp and determined, but he was also realistic about the challenges they faced. Brennan's lawyers are going to try to discredit Cole, Thatcher explained during one of their meetings. They'll paint him as a desperate man looking for someone to blame for his troubles. They'll suggest he acted alone, that Brennan knew nothing about the fire. But we have the letters, Clara said. Brennan's own handwriting giving Cole instructions, which they'll claim are forgeries or that they've been taken out of context. We need more than just the letters. We need to establish a pattern. We need other victims to come forward to show that this wasn't an isolated incident, but a deliberate strategy. James had already been working on this. He'd tracked down 3 other property owners who'd sold to Brennan after suspicious accidents. 2 were willing to testify. The 3rd had moved to California and couldn't be reached. But he'd sent a sworn statement describing how his barn had burned down a week before Brennan made an offer on his land. We also need to prepare you for testimony, Thatcher told Eli. You're the victim here, and your account of what happened will be crucial. But Brennan's lawyers are going to try to make you look like a man with a grudge, someone who's looking for someone to blame for his own failures. Let them try, Eli said. But Clara saw the tension in his jaw, the way his hands clenched when Thatcher described the cross-examination he'd face. That evening, after their meeting with the prosecutor, Clara asked Eli to walk with her. They headed out of town, following the road that led toward his ranch. They'd made this walk several times over the past weeks, always stopping before they reached the property, as if by unspoken agreement. Are you ready for this? Clara asked. The trial, the testimony, all of it? I don't know if anyone's ever ready to face something like this, Eli said. But I'll do it, I have to. Not just for me, but for everyone else Brennan's hurt. You've changed, Clara observed. 6 months ago you would have wanted to handle this alone. Now you're thinking about the bigger picture. 6 months ago, I was so wrapped up in my own pride I couldn't see past it. You and James showed me that some things are bigger than one man's ego. They walked in silence for a while, the mountains rising dark against the evening sky. Finally, Clara spoke again. I've been thinking about what happens after the trial. Win or lose, we're going to need to move forward. I know, James and I still want to help you rebuild. The offer of partnership still stands. But Eli, I need to know, where do you and I stand? I've been patient. I've given you space, but I need to know if there's a future for us, or if I should start planning a different kind of life. Eli stopped walking. He'd been avoiding this conversation, this decision for weeks. Part of him was still afraid. Afraid of failing again, afraid of not being enough, afraid of all the things that could go wrong. But a larger part of him knew the truth he'd been dancing around. I want you back, he said simply. I want to be married to you again, to build a life together. But Clara, I'm scared. What if I fail again? What if I can't be the partner you deserve? Clara turned to face him, and in the fading light her eyes were steady and sure. Then you fail and we figure it out together. That's what partnership means, Eli. Not that you'll never fail, but that when you do, you won't be alone. I'm not the same woman you married 5 years ago. I'm stronger, more independent. But I still love you, and I still believe in us. Eli reached into his pocket and pulled out the wedding ring he'd been carrying since the divorce. I've kept this with me every day, every single day since you left. It felt like if I let go of it, I'd be letting go of us completely. Clara held out her hand, and Eli saw that she was trembling slightly. He slid the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, like it had never been gone at all. I can't promise I won't make mistakes, Eli said. I can't promise everything will be easy. I don't want easy, Clara said. I want real. I want a partnership built on honesty and trust. Can you give me that? I can try, Eli said. I can promise to try every day. Clara stepped into his arms, and they held each other as the sun set over the mountains. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. There was still a trial ahead, still a ranch to rebuild, still years of work to undo the damage Brennan had caused. But it was a beginning. And that was enough. The next morning, they announced their engagement to James. He grinned and pulled them both into a bear hug. "About time," he said. "I was starting to think you two would dance around each other forever." "We're not getting married until after the trial," Clara said. "We want to start our new life with this chapter closed." "Fair enough," James said. "But I'm standing up with you when you do, and that's not negotiable." As the trial date approached, the town prepared like it was getting ready for a festival. The courthouse couldn't hold everyone who wanted to attend, so they set up a system where people could wait outside and hear updates during breaks. The hotel was fully booked with journalists from Helena and even as far as Denver. Everyone wanted to see the powerful Howard Brennan brought to justice. The night before the trial, Eli couldn't sleep. He sat up in his room, going over his testimony in his mind, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. Clara found him there after midnight, unable to sleep herself. "I keep thinking about the fire," Eli said. "About that night when I rode up and saw everything burning. I was so angry then, so convinced it was my fault somehow. If I'd been there, if I'd been more careful, if I'd done things differently." "It wasn't your fault," Clara said firmly. "It was Brennan's fault and Cole's fault, and tomorrow we're going to prove that. What if the jury doesn't believe us? What if Brennan's lawyers are good enough to create doubt? Then we deal with it. But Eli, we have the truth on our side. We have evidence, witnesses, documentation. We have Cole's testimony and Brennan's own letters. Justice doesn't always prevail, but this time, I think it will." Eli looked at the woman he'd almost lost, the woman who'd fought for him when he couldn't fight for himself. "However this turns out, I want you to know you saved me. Not just from the debt, but from myself. From drowning in pride and self-pity. We saved each other," Clara corrected. "I was running away from hard things until this showed me I could face them. You were trying to carry everything alone until this showed you the strength in asking for help. We both grew, and maybe that's what we needed." Dawn came too quickly. Eli dressed carefully in his best suit, the one he'd worn to his wedding and hadn't touched since. Clara met him at the boarding house, wearing a simple but elegant dress. James arrived with a wagon, ready to drive them all to the courthouse. The building was already crowded when they arrived. People lined the steps, packed the hallways, filled every seat in the courtroom. Marshal Hendricks had deputized extra men to keep order. The journalists had claimed the best vantage points, their notebooks ready. Prosecutor Thatcher met them in a side room. "Remember what we practiced. Tell the truth clearly and simply. Don't let the defense lawyers rattle you. If you don't know something, say you don't know. Don't guess, don't speculate." Cole was there too, looking pale but determined. "I'm ready," he said when Eli approached him. "I know what I did was wrong. I'm ready to face the consequences, but I'm going to make sure Brennan faces his, too." When they entered the courtroom, Eli saw Brennan for the first time since his arrest. The man sat at the defense table, dressed impeccably, his expression confident. His lawyers surrounded him, a wall of expensive legal talent. Brennan's eyes swept the room and landed on Eli. For a moment their gazes locked. Eli saw no remorse there, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Just calculation and contempt. Brennan clearly believed his money and influence would get him out of this, that these small-town people with their small-town prosecutor couldn't touch him. "All rise," the bailiff called. "The territorial court is now in session, the Honorable Judge Samuel Pierce presiding." Judge Pierce entered, a man in his 60s with white hair and stern features. He was known throughout the territory as a fair but tough jurist, someone who couldn't be bought or intimidated. As everyone settled into their seats, Eli reached for Clara's hand. She squeezed his fingers, a silent promise of support. On his other side, James sat solid and steady, a rock in uncertain waters. The trial was about to begin. After months of investigation, preparation, and anticipation, they would finally have their day in court. Justice would be served or denied. Truth would be revealed or obscured. But whatever happened, Eli knew he wouldn't face it alone. The clerk began reading the charges. The Territory versus Howard James Brennan. Charges include arson in the first degree, fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and extortion. The list went on. each charge representing another life damaged, another person hurt by Brennan's greed. Thatcher stood to make his opening statement, and the packed courtroom fell silent. This was it, the moment that would determine not just Eli's future, but the futures of everyone Brennan had wronged. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Thatcher began, his voice clear and strong, "this case is about a man who believed himself above the law, a man who destroyed lives and livelihoods in pursuit of profit. But it's also about something more important. It's about ordinary people who refused to be victims, who sought the truth and demanded justice. Over the coming days, you will hear their stories. You will see the evidence, and I trust that you will do what is right." Eli listened to the prosecutor lay out their case, watched the jury's faces as they absorbed the information. This was the culmination of everything, all the pain, all the struggle, all the hard lessons learned. The outcome was uncertain, but the fight was righteous, and that had to be enough. The prosecution's case unfolded methodically over 3 days. Thatcher was thorough, building his argument piece by piece, like a craftsman assembling a complex mechanism. He started with the easy facts: the fire, the debt, the timeline of events. Then he began connecting them to Brennan. Clara testified first among their group. She walked to the witness stand with her head high, and Eli felt a surge of pride watching her. She explained the financial records clearly, showing the jury how the debt had been artificially inflated after Brennan purchased it from the original collection agency. "These charges here," she said, pointing to entries in the ledger, "were never part of the original loan agreement. They appeared only after Mr. Brennan acquired the debt. Late fees calculated on fees that didn't exist. Interest compounded in ways that violated territorial lending laws. By my calculation, the debt was inflated by nearly 43%. Brennan's lead attorney, a silver-haired man named Hutchins, tried to shake her testimony during cross-examination. "Mrs. Mercer, or should I say Miss Whitmore, since you're divorced, isn't it possible you simply don't understand the complex nature of debt collection?" "It's Miss Whitmore for now," Clara said calmly, "though that will change soon. And no, Mr. Hutchins, it's not possible I misunderstood. I managed my husband's rifle business for 4 years. I'm quite capable of reading financial documents and recognizing fraud when I see it." Several jury members nodded, and Eli saw Hutchins's jaw tighten. He'd underestimated Clara, assumed she'd be easy to intimidate. He was learning otherwise. James testified next, describing Cole's presence in town before the fire, the supplies he'd purchased, the questions he'd asked about Eli's property. James's testimony was straightforward and unshakable. Hutchins barely bothered to cross-examine him, perhaps realizing that attacking a respected businessman would only alienate the jury further. Then came Cole himself. He walked to the stand like a man heading to his own execution, but his voice was steady as he was sworn in. Thatcher took him through his story, step by step, the initial contact with Brennan, the payment, the instructions for setting the fire, the aftermath. "Mr. Cole," Thatcher said, "do you see the man who hired you to commit arson in this courtroom?" "I do," Cole said, looking directly at Brennan. "That's him, Howard Brennan. Let the record show the witness identified the defendant," Judge Pierce said. Thatcher held up the letters Cole had saved. "Are these the communications you received from Mr. Brennan?" "They are. That's his handwriting, his signature. He was careful mostly, but those letters spell out everything. When to do it, how to do it, what he'd pay." When Hutchins rose for cross-examination, his strategy was clear: destroy Cole's credibility completely. "Mr. Cole, you're a confessed arsonist, correct?" "I am. You destroyed a man's livelihood, his property, nearly caused the death of his wife. You did all this for money." "Yes, sir. And I regret it every day." "Convenient regret," Hutchins said with a sneer. "Tell me, Mr. Cole, how much is the prosecution paying you to testify against my client?" "Nothing. I'm testifying because it's the truth, or because you need someone to blame for your own crimes. Perhaps you acted alone out of simple greed, and now you're trying to drag an innocent man down with you. That's not what happened. You expect this jury to believe the word of a confessed criminal over that of a respected businessman. Cole's voice hardened. I expect them to read those letters. I expect them to look at the pattern. I'm not the only person whose property burned before Brennan bought it. I'm just the only one willing to admit what I did. Hutchins continued his assault, but Cole held firm. He admitted his guilt freely, accepted responsibility for his actions, but never wavered on Brennan's involvement. By the time the cross-examination ended, the jury looked more sympathetic to Cole than Hutchins probably wanted. The other property owners testified, each describing similar circumstances, sudden accidents or fires, followed by Brennan's offers to buy their land at reduced prices. The pattern was unmistakable. One man, a rancher named Peterson, broke down on the stand describing how the loss of his barn had forced him to sell his family's homestead. We'd been on that land for 30 years, Peterson said, his voice cracking. My father built that barn with his own hands. After it burned, I couldn't afford to rebuild. Brennan knew that. He came to me 3 days later with an offer that was half what the land was worth. What choice did I have? On the third day, it was Eli's turn. He'd been dreading this moment, but as he walked to the witness stand and placed his hand on the Bible, he felt a strange calm settle over him. This was his chance to speak the truth, to tell his story, and no amount of expensive lawyers could take that away from him. Thatcher guided him through the testimony carefully. Eli described his life before the fire, the ranch, his rifle-making business, his marriage to Clara. He described the fire itself, the devastation of seeing years of work destroyed in a single night. He described the debt, the letters from collectors, the downward spiral that had cost him everything. Mr. Mercer, Thatcher said, when you were struggling with this debt, did you know that Howard Brennan had purchased it and was manipulating the terms? No, sir. I thought I'd somehow miscalculated, that I was responsible for debts I didn't remember taking on. I thought I'd failed. And what impact did this have on your marriage? Eli glanced at Clara, sitting in the gallery. It destroyed it, or I thought it did. I pushed my wife away because I was ashamed. The divorce was my fault in a way, even though the circumstances that led to it were Brennan's doing. One final question. Mr. Mercer, if you'd known then what you know now, that the fire was arson, that the debt was fraudulent, how would that have changed things? Eli considered carefully. I would have fought. I would have asked for help. I would have trusted the people who loved me instead of shutting them out. That's what Brennan took from me, not just my workshop or my money, but my faith in myself and others. That's what I want back. When Hutchins approached for cross-examination, Eli steeled himself. This was the moment the defense attorney would try to tear him down, to make him look like a bitter man seeking revenge rather than justice. Mr. Mercer, Hutchins began, his tone deceptively gentle. You've had quite a difficult year, haven't you? I have. Lost your business, your home, your wife. That must create a great deal of anger. It created a great deal of pain. The anger came later when I learned the truth. Or perhaps the anger was always there, and you simply needed someone to blame. Hutchins paced in front of the jury box. Isn't it possible that you made poor business decisions, overextended yourself financially, and rather than accept responsibility, you've concocted this elaborate conspiracy theory? No, sir, that's not what happened. You admit you hid financial information from your wife. You admit you made choices that worsened your situation. Doesn't that suggest a pattern of poor judgment? Eli felt his temper rising, but kept his voice level. I made mistakes. I should have been honest with Clara about how bad things were. But those mistakes didn't cause the fire. Howard Brennan caused the fire, so you say. But Mr. Mercer, you're asking this jury to believe that a successful businessman would risk everything, his reputation, his freedom, to acquire your property. Why? What makes your land so special? The silver deposits, the geological survey that shows significant mineral wealth on my property and the surrounding land. Brennan knew about it. That's why he wanted to force me out. Hutchins smiled. Alleged silver deposits. Speculation, not proven fact. You're suggesting my client committed serious crimes based on geological speculation. I'm suggesting your client knew something valuable was on my land and decided to take it by any means necessary. Or perhaps Hutchins said, turning to the jury. "You've convinced yourself of this narrative because it's easier than accepting that sometimes bad things happen without a villain to blame." Thatcher objected. "Argumentative, Your Honor." "Sustained," Judge Pierce said. "Mr. Hutchins, ask questions, don't make speeches." Hutchins continued for another 20 minutes, probing every aspect of Eli's testimony, looking for contradictions or weaknesses. But Eli held firm. He'd lived through this nightmare, and no amount of legal maneuvering could change the facts. Finally, Hutchins dismissed him with a wave. "No further questions." Eli returned to his seat, exhausted but relieved. Clara squeezed his hand. "You did well," she whispered. The prosecution rested their case. Now it was Brennan's turn to present his defense. His lawyers called character witnesses, businessmen who praised Brennan's integrity, civic leaders who described his charitable donations, associates who swore he'd never be involved in anything criminal. They painted a picture of a pillar of the community, a man above reproach. But they couldn't explain away the letters in Brennan's own handwriting. They couldn't account for the pattern of fires preceding his property acquisitions. They couldn't erase the testimony of multiple victims who described identical circumstances. When Brennan himself took the stand, the courtroom grew silent. This was what everyone had been waiting for, to hear the accused speak in his own defense. Hutchins led him through a carefully prepared statement. Brennan claimed the letters to Cole were forgeries. He said the fires were coincidental, that he'd simply taken advantage of opportunities when they presented themselves. He portrayed himself as a savvy businessman, not a criminal. "Mr. Brennan," Hutchins asked, "did you hire John Cole to commit arson?" "Absolutely not. I've never seen that man before this trial. Did you manipulate Mr. Mercer's debt to force him into selling his property?" "No, I purchased the debt as a business investment. Any fees or charges that accrued were standard practice in debt collection." But when Thatcher stood for cross-examination, Brennan's composure began to crack. "Mr. Brennan, you claim you've never met John Cole, yet we have 3 witnesses who saw you meeting with him in Helena 2 weeks before the fire. How do you explain that?" "They're mistaken. It must have been someone else. 3 different people, all mistaken about seeing you with the man who later burned down Mr. Mercer's workshop." "That's quite a coincidence." Brennan's jaw tightened. "I meet many people in the course of business. Perhaps I encountered him briefly and don't recall." "So now you have met him, but you don't remember? Which is it, Mr. Brennan?" "I'm saying these accusations are baseless." Thatcher held up the letters. "This is your handwriting, isn't it? We have samples from your business correspondence. We've had an expert compare them. The writing matches. Those letters could have been fabricated, altered by whom? Mr. Cole, who's confessing to his own crimes. What possible motive would he have to forge letters that implicate himself in arson? I don't know. Perhaps he's being paid by Mr. Mercer to... We've already established Mr. Mercer has no money to pay anyone. He lost everything in the fire you orchestrated." "I didn't orchestrate anything." The outburst echoed through the courtroom. Brennan realized his mistake immediately, but it was too late. The jury had seen behind the mask of respectability to the angry, desperate man beneath. Thatcher pressed his advantage. "Mr. Brennan, isn't it true that you've acquired 7 properties in this valley, all after suspicious accidents? Isn't it true that you knew about the mineral deposits and wanted to control access to them? Isn't it true that you hired John Cole to burn down Eli Mercer's workshop because Mr. Mercer refused to sell?" "No, that's not. You're twisting everything. I'm asking simple yes or no questions, Mr. Brennan. Did you or did you not hire John Cole to commit arson?" Brennan looked at his lawyers, but they could offer no escape. He looked at the jury and seemed to realize that his denials were no longer believable. "I want to invoke my right to refuse to answer on grounds it might incriminate me." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Judge Pierce banged his gavel for order. "A bit late for that, Mr. Brennan," Thatcher said. "You chose to testify. You don't get to pick and choose which questions to answer." "I'm done," Brennan said. "I'm done with this circus. Answer the question," Judge Pierce ordered. But Brennan just sat there, silent and seething. Finally, Judge Pierce dismissed him from the stand, and the defense rested without calling further witnesses. There was nothing more they could do. The closing arguments came next. Hutchins did his best to create doubt, to suggest that the evidence was circumstantial, that Cole's testimony was unreliable. But his heart wasn't in it. The case had gotten away from him. Thatcher's closing was powerful and direct. Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard the testimony. You've seen the evidence. You've watched the defendant refuse to answer direct questions about his actions. The truth is clear. Howard Brennan destroyed lives to increase his wealth. He hired an arsonist. He manipulated financial records. He believed his money and influence would protect him from consequences. Today, you have the power to prove him wrong. Today, you can deliver justice for Eli Mercer and everyone else Brennan has wronged. I trust you'll do what's right. The jury retired to deliberate. Eli, Clara, and James waited in the courthouse hallway with dozens of other townspeople. Hours passed. Evening fell. Still the jury deliberated. Finally, after nearly 7 hours, word came. The jury had reached a verdict. The courtroom filled quickly as word spread that the jury was returning. Eli took his seat between Clara and James, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. Everything had led to this moment. Months of investigation, weeks of testimony, years of pain and loss. Now 12 strangers would decide whether justice would be served. Judge Pierce entered, and everyone rose. When they sat again, the silence was absolute. The jury filed in, their faces solemn and unreadable. The foreman, a rancher named McAllister, who Eli had known for years, held a piece of paper in his weathered hands. Has the jury reached a verdict? Judge Pierce asked. We have, Your Honor. On the charge of arson in the first degree, how do you find? McAllister's voice was clear and firm. We find the defendant guilty. A collective exhale swept through the courtroom. But the foreman wasn't finished. On the charge of fraud, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to commit fraud, guilty. On the charge of extortion, guilty. Guilty on all counts. Eli felt Clara's hand tighten around his. On his other side, James let out a breath he'd been holding. In front of them, Howard Brennan sat rigid, his face drained of color. Judge Pierce banged his gavel as voices rose throughout the courtroom. Order, I'll have order. When silence returned, he addressed Brennan. Mr. Brennan, you've been found guilty of serious crimes. Sentencing will be held 2 weeks from today. Until then, you'll remain in custody. Bail is revoked. As the deputies led Brennan away, he looked back at Eli. There was no remorse in his expression, only hatred and disbelief. He'd been so certain his money would save him, and now he was facing years in prison. Outside the courthouse, it seemed like half of Copper Bend had gathered. People cheered, shook Eli's hand, congratulated Clara and James. The journalists scrambled to interview anyone involved in the case. It was chaos, but it was joyful chaos. The celebration of justice served. That evening, after the crowds had dispersed and the excitement had faded, Eli stood on the porch of his ranch house. He'd ridden out alone, needing time to process everything that had happened. The workshop was still a charred ruin, but the house stood intact. The land stretched out before him in the gathering darkness. The same land his grandfather had claimed. His father had worked, and he had nearly lost. He heard a horse approaching and turned to see Clara riding up the path. She dismounted and came to stand beside him, looking out at the mountains. I thought I'd find you here, she said. I needed to see it, to remember what we're fighting for. Not fighting anymore, Clara said. We won. We did. Eli put his arm around her shoulders. I keep thinking about everything that happened. The fire, the divorce, all of it. And I realize that in a strange way, losing everything was what I needed. How so? Because it forced me to see what really mattered. I thought my identity was tied up in this ranch, in my work, in being self-sufficient. But I learned that identity comes from the people who stand by you, who fight for you even when you don't deserve it. I learned that the strongest thing I could do was admit I needed help. We both learned things, Clara said. I learned I was stronger than I thought, that I could face hard times instead of running from them. We broke apart so we could build something better. 2 weeks later, they stood in the same church where they'd married 5 years earlier. This time, with James as witness and half the town in attendance, they renewed their vows. Eli slid the wedding ring back onto Clara's finger, and this time it felt different. Not just a symbol of love, but of partnership, of trust, earned and rebuilt. The sentencing hearing came the next day. Judge Pierce was not lenient. Howard Brennan received 15 years in territorial prison, plus restitution to all his victims. His property holdings were to be liquidated, with the proceeds distributed to those he'd defrauded. For Eli, it meant not only the return of his land free and clear, but also enough money to rebuild his workshop and restock his tools. Spring came early to Montana that year. By April, construction was underway on the new workshop. It was larger than the original, with windows on all sides to catch the light. James had invested, as they'd discussed, becoming a full partner in the rifle-making business. Clara set up an office in the ranch house, managing orders and correspondence with the same skill she'd shown during the trial. Eli hired 2 apprentices, young men from town who wanted to learn the craft. He taught them the way his father had taught him, patiently, with attention to detail and respect for the tradition they were carrying forward. His rifles began to sell again, and this time the orders came not just because of their quality, but because of the story behind them. People wanted to own a piece of work made by the man who'd stood up to Howard Brennan and won. One evening in June, Eli and Clara sat on their porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. The workshop hummed with activity. One of the apprentices was finishing up the day's work. Smoke rose from the forge, a sign of industry and life. Do you ever think about what might have happened if James hadn't found those rifles? Clara asked. If we hadn't started investigating. Sometimes, Eli admitted, but I try not to dwell on it. We did investigate. We did fight back. That's what matters. James is coming for dinner tomorrow, Clara said. I thought we'd discuss expanding the business. Maybe opening a storefront in town. Eli smiled. The woman beside him was no longer just his wife. She was his partner in every sense of the word. Together with James, they'd built something stronger than what existed before the fire. They'd built trust, friendship, and a business based on integrity. In the distance, a rider appeared on the road, probably one of their customers coming to place an order or check on progress. Eli stood to greet them, Clara rising with him. They walked together down the porch steps, ready to face whatever came next. The past would always be part of their story, the fire, the betrayal, the divorce, the trial. But it didn't define them anymore. They'd taken their pain and transformed it into something better. They'd learned that some truths really did hit harder than bullets. And some hearts really didn't quit, even when you thought they had. Most importantly, they'd learned that the hardest thing to rebuild wasn't a ranch or a workshop, or even a marriage. It was trust. But once rebuilt on solid foundation, it was stronger than anything that had come before. As they greeted their visitor and invited them into the house, Eli looked back at Clara and caught her eye. She smiled, and in that smile was everything: forgiveness, love, hope, and the quiet confidence of 2 people who'd weathered the storm and come out stronger on the other side. The sun set over the Montana mountains, casting long shadows across the valley. But in the Mercer ranch house, the lamps were lit, the forge was warm, and the future stretched ahead like an open road, full of possibility and promise. Sometimes, Eli would think about that night at the Silver Spur Saloon when he'd seen Clara with James and assumed the worst. He'd been so close to walking away, so close to letting pride and pain make his decisions for him. But he'd stayed. He'd listened. He'd chosen to trust, even when trust seemed impossible. That choice had made all the difference. Years later, folks in Copper Bend still told the story of Eli Mercer, the man who lost everything and gained it back through courage, love, and the willingness to accept help when he needed it most. They told it as a reminder that justice could prevail, that truth mattered. That community meant standing together against those who would prey on the vulnerable. But for Eli and Clara, the story wasn't about justice or revenge. It was about second chances. It was about learning that strength came not from standing alone, but from standing together. It was about building a life not on the foundation of pride, but on the foundation of trust, and that, they both knew, was worth more than all the silver in the Montana mountains.